Over the past year and a half, I've researched the death row stories and final meals of over 100 different inmates from around the world and ranked them all on a tier list. These meals vary in the time period in which they were ordered, the quantity of the food, and the local regulations at the time. However, to remain consistent, I've ranked them all purely based off of my own subjective enjoyment of the meal as a whole. So today, I've taken a look back through all the meals I've covered thus far, made any adjustments in terms of ranking that I've deemed as necessary, and today, I'm going to present them all to you in order from the very worst to the very best, with each meal being better than the last. Over the past year and a half, I have spent literally over 1,000 hours doing the cooking, researching, and editing for these videos, all for this final result. My friends, I don't think that my words can adequately communicate or express the sheer weight of the gratitude that I feel for all of the support that you guys have given me from the very beginning of this series. But with that being said, thank you. Thank you guys so much. And from the bottom of my heart, I sincerely hope you enjoy my Death Row Final Meal tier list in its totality. I'm rating every Death Row Final Meal request to find out which one's the greatest of all time. Today, we're looking at the selection of Victor Feguer. In the summer of 1960, Feguer phoned a local doctor from the Yellow Pages and claimed that a woman needed medical attention. However, when the doctor arrived, Feguer kidnapped him and killed him with a single gunshot to the head. When he was finally captured, Feguer was tried and sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal of choice, Feguer had the unique request of a single unpitted olive. And before his execution, he told the guards that he hoped an olive tree would sprout from his grave as one final sign of peace. In my opinion, the sentiment behind this gesture was nice, but as a final meal, this choice was pretty atrocious. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're looking at the tarot card dealer who practiced voodooism and black magic, James Edward Smith. In April of 1984, Smith was found guilty of murdering 44-year-old Larry Don Rojas during his attempted robbery of the Union National Insurance Company. As a result, Smith was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Then for his final meal, Smith requested a clump of Riacunda dirt, a soil he planned to consume for a voodoo reincarnation ritual. However, Smith's request was denied because dirt was not on the list of approved foods. He instead settled for 1 cup of yogurt. In my opinion, either of these two options would make for a pretty abysmal final meal. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Damsel of Death, Aileen Wuornos. Between the years of 1989 and 1990, Wuornos worked as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, but when she'd meet up with each man, she'd proceed to rob and kill them with her .22 caliber revolver. And by the time she was captured after 14 months at large, Wuornos had killed a total of 7 men. And almost immediately upon being detained, Wuornos and her attorneys were approached with offers to buy the media rights to this story, and they agreed to these offers, thus resulting in several books, films, and even an opera. However, when she got to court, Wuornos would have received 6 separate death sentences and was condemned to die by lethal injection. On her final day, Wuornos declined her right to a final meal and instead opted for a single cup of black coffee. In my opinion, coffee as a beverage is great, but coffee as the entirety of your final meal request is not. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Leo Pilo Echegaray. In the year 1994, Echegaray lived with his lover Rosalie and her 5 young children at their home in Quezon City. Within this household, Leo was the primary breadwinner and the couple initially had a strong relationship. However, over time, as Rosalie would go out to gamble, Leo would order the eldest daughter, 10-year-old Rodessa, to stay in the home with him and for the younger siblings to leave. And once they were alone, Leo would drag 10-year-old Rodessa into a room and sexually violate her. This secret abuse would go on for up to 5 total assaults until Rodessa informed her grandmother and Leo was captured. As a result of these crimes, Leo was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Leo requested sardines, dried fish, and rice. In my opinion, these types of fish aren't bad, but overall, the spread was pretty bland. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Charles Starkweather. On December 1st, 1957, Starkweather walked into a local gas station and attempted to buy a stuffed animal on credit. However, when the clerk refused, Starkweather kidnapped him, drove him to a remote area, and executed him with a shotgun. And though this was Starkweather's first time killing, it only emboldened him, as over the course of the next 60 days, 18-year-old Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend went on to kill 10 more victims. Among these targets was his girlfriend's parents and half-sister, a family friend, and a pair pair of teenagers who had offered them a ride. In the end, the pair was captured, and despite his attempts to plead insanity, Starkweather was sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Starkweather simply requested assorted cold cuts. In my opinion, there's no two ways about it. This pick was rubbish, and I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are looking at the selection of the founder of the Crips and Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Stanley Tookie Williams. In 1971, Williams rose to prominence when he founded LA's first major African-American street gang known as the Crips. But after 8 years of growing this organization, he was arrested for 4 separate murders and sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, during the 25 years between his sentencing and execution, Williams submitted multiple appeals, authored 9 children's books, and set forth on a campaign to educate the youth about the dangers of gang life. And while this advocacy even led Williams to eventually be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger opted not to grant him clemency. So for his final meal, Williams denied any special final meal request and instead opted to eat the standard fare of a bowl of oatmeal and some milk. In my opinion, the meal definitely wasn't anything special, but in the best interest of my personal safety, I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of Gerald Lee Mitchell. On June 4th, 1985, Mitchell and a friend approached the car of Charles Marino and Kenneth Fleming and offered to sell them marijuana. When they agreed, Mitchell said he'd lead them to a nearby house, but instead brought them to a dead end, pulled out a shotgun, and demanded their car keys. Reluctantly, the pair complied, and Mitchell led them to a vacant house and forced them to sit on the floor. Once they were seated, Mitchell told his accompanying friend to go grab some rope, but when doing so, he fled the scene and did not return. So when just the 3 remained, Mitchell said, "Raise your hands, white boy. You don't want to die with your hands down," and proceeded to shoot both boys with his shotgun, killing one and wounding the other. For these crimes, Mitchell was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Mitchell requested 1 bag of assorted Jolly Ranchers. In my opinion, Jolly Ranchers are okay, but this spread was definitely lacking in variety, quantity, and overall quality. So, I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Véronique Frantz. In the year 1852, Frantz was hired to work as a servant for 43-year-old George Guntz, a wealthy winemaker who lived with his wife, son, and parents. Despite her role as a housemaid, Frantz was treated like family, thanks to all her diligence and hard work. However, when Guntz's wife fell ill a few months after she started, he told Frantz that he'd consider her as a potential partner should his wife pass away. So, over the course of the following months, she secretly poisoned Guntz's mother-in-law and wife. But when Guntz decided to remarry with a woman from another town instead of her, Frantz would poison him as well. In the end, local townsfolk became suspicious of Frantz, and she was tried and sentenced to death by decapitation. For her final meal, Frantz requested a café au lait and a bread roll. In my opinion, I'm a fan of both of these items, but as a final meal ever, it leaves a lot to be desired. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the Black Widow, Judy Buenoano. Beginning in 1971, all the loved ones in Buenoano's life gradually began to disappear. First, when her husband returned from his military service in Vietnam, he suddenly became ill and passed away shortly thereafter. Then the next year, the same thing happened to her new boyfriend. And a couple years after that, even her son would die under mysterious circumstances as well. But still, no one suspected a thing. But when her last fiance's car exploded with him behind the wheel, people grew suspicious. And in the end, it was found that Judy was responsible for all these deaths just so she could collect the life insurance policies on the victims. Thus, she was sentenced to death by electrocution. For her final meal, Buenoano requested steamed broccoli, asparagus, tomato wedges with lemon, strawberries, and hot tea. In my opinion, the spread did have some variety, but it certainly wasn't the kind I was looking for. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are looking at the selection of one of the oldest people executed in U.S. history, James Barney Hubbard. On January 10th, 1977, 46-year-old James Hubbard called the police to report that his friend Lillian Montgomery had shot herself. However, when the police arrived, it quickly became evident that Hubbard was the one who fired the 3 shots that ultimately killed her. So for this crime, James Barney Hubbard was sentenced to death by lethal injection. And although it took 27 years of waiting on death row after his sentencing, Hubbard was finally executed at the age of 74 years old. For his final meal, Hubbard requested 2 eggs fried over medium, 4 slices of bacon, sliced tomatoes, fried green tomatoes, pineapple slices with mayonnaise, white bread, a banana, and a medium-sized bottle of V8 juice. In my opinion, I'm not quite sure why, but personally, I just could not see the vision Hubbard was going for here. So, I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of the deadliest domestic terrorist in U.S. history, Timothy McVeigh. On the morning of April 19, 1995, McVeigh parked a truck armed with 5,000 pounds of explosives in front of a federal building in Oklahoma City. Later that day, the bomb exploded, killing 168 and injuring almost 700 others. As a result of these crimes, McVeigh was charged guilty on 11 federal counts, including one for the use of a weapon of mass destruction. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For McVeigh's final meal, his request was simple: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. In my opinion, ice cream alone is a poor final meal choice, and choosing mint chocolate chip as the flavor only makes the decision worse. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are looking at the selection of Douglas Franklin Wright. On September 4th, 1969, Wright broke into his neighbor's home and proceeded to murder her and her daughter, then kidnapped her 5-year-old son, whom he violated in multiple hotels, and then released. When Wright was captured and asked why he took the young boy, he said he always wanted a son of his own. And though he would receive a 35-year prison sentence, he would only end up serving 12 due to good behavior. And immediately upon his release, he went on a spree of robberies and then kidnapped a 10-year-old boy who he proceeded to violate for 36 hours and then shot him 6 times. Now, he was sentenced to 30 more years in prison, but again was released in just 7. And right when he got out this time, he lured 3 homeless men out to the desert and shot them all. As a result, he was finally sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Wright had the simple request of 1 honey bun. In my opinion, the honey bun definitely wasn't a bad dish, but as a final meal, this pick was weak. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the U.S. Army Master Sergeant Lewis Jones Jr. On the morning of February 18, 1995, Jones drove onto the Goodfellow Air Force Base in search of his ex-wife, with whom he had a violent altercation earlier that week. However, as he was doing so, he instead came across a different woman with a similar appearance, 19-year-old Tracy McBride. At this moment, Jones hallucinated seeing black smoke and hearing Satan laughing, and thus, he decided to kidnap her at gunpoint. After bringing her to his home, Jones then proceeded to sexually violate her, drove her out into the country, then beat her to death with a tire iron. As a result of this crime, Jones was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Jones requested whole peaches, plums, and nectarines. In my opinion, I'm a fan of all these fruits, but for a final meal, this pick is a bit too one-noted. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the death row granny, Velma Barfield. By the year 1977, Barfield had become addicted to prescription drugs, and each of her 2 prior husbands had passed away. But still, she'd go on to get a new boyfriend, and to fund her addiction, began forging checks and killing the people she had defrauded. However, eventually Barfield started to notice her boyfriend growing suspicious, so she mixed rat poison into his beer and tea, which ultimately killed him. In the end, it was discovered that Barfield had claimed the lives of 6 total victims, and thus, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Barfield requested just 2 prison canteen items: cheese puffs and Coca-Cola. The prison warden also knew that Barfield's favorite treat was a Kit Kat bar, so as a gift, he brought her one as well. In my opinion, this spread was definitely unique, but unfortunately, not unique in a good way. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of King Charles I of England. During the early 1600s, England was embroiled in an internal power struggle between the kingdom's parliament and the reigning King Charles I. Throughout his rule, Charles strongly believed in the divine right of kings, which often led him to subverting parliamentary approval on mandates and imposing religious conformity across the kingdom. However, in 1642, these tensions would eventually escalate to what is now known as the English Civil War. Here, the royalist supporters of the king were pitted against the parliamentarians who opposed his overreach, and in the end, the parliamentarians emerged victorious. King Charles was found guilty for treason, and he was ultimately sentenced to death by decapitation with an axe. For his final meal, Charles consumed the simple staples of bread and wine. In my opinion, there's nothing bad about this spread, but it doesn't stack up to the others on this list. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the happiest inmate on death row, Joe Arridy. On the night of August 14, 1936, an intruder broke into a Colorado family home, murdered one of the daughters, and escaped undetected. For this crime, a man named Frank Aguilar was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, the police decided to also bring in the 46 IQ Joe Arridy for questioning too. Here, the officers easily manipulated Arridy into wrongfully admitting guilt, and thus he was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas as well. While on death row, Arridy would happily sit and play with his toy train and showed no understanding of his impending execution. So much so that after eating his requested final meals of ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he asked if they could refrigerate his leftovers for later. In my opinion, ice cream's an excellent part of a final meal, but alone, it leaves a bit to be desired. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of John Richard Baltazar. On September 27, 1997, Baltazar heard that his mother's boyfriend, Narciso Cuellar, had beaten her with a baseball bat. So later that evening, he and a friend went to his house to seek revenge. When they arrived, Baltazar knew that Cuellar typically slept on the living room couch. So the pair kicked down the door and opened fire at this target. However, after the hail of gunfire, Cuellar was nowhere to be found, and on the couch instead lied the corpse of 5-year-old Adriana Marines and her injured cousin, who had together been watching the Sleeping Beauty. As a result of this crime, Baltazar was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Baltazar requested Cool Whip and cherries, but unfortunately for him, this request was denied. In my opinion, cherries and Cool Whip is an elite combo, but for a final meal, it's just not enough. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the monster preacher Gary Michael Heidnik. Between November of 1986 and March of 1987, Heidnik led what was seemingly a normal existence. He lived in North Philadelphia and served as a bishop at the church he started. However, behind closed doors, this couldn't have been further from the truth. In reality, during this same period, Heidnik secretly kidnapped 6 women and chained them up within a self-dug pit in his basement. And over the 5 months that he held these women captive, he subjected them to extreme sexual and physical abuse and even ended up killing 2 of them in the process. However, after one of his victims eventually escaped and alerted the police, Heidnik was captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Heidnik requested 2 slices of cheese pizza and coffee. In my opinion, these 2 dishes don't really mix well, and even if they did, the spread would still be pretty weak. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Carla Faye Tucker. On the early morning of June 13th, 1983, Tucker and her boyfriend Danny Garrett broke into the apartment of their friends Jerry and Deborah with the intention of stealing their motorcycle. However, upon entering, an altercation broke out and Garrett struck Jerry in the back of the head with a ball-peen hammer. But when this caused him to start gurgling, Tucker struck him with a pickaxe to silence the noise. Then, as the duo prepared to leave the scene, Tucker spotted Deborah hiding in the bed and struck her multiple times with the pickaxe as well. For these 2 murders, Tucker was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Tucker requested a garden salad with ranch dressing, a peach, and a banana. In my opinion, as a normal meal, this spread is already a little weak, but as a final meal ever, this lineup is just rubbish. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the traveling watchmaker known as Uncle Tick-Tock, Adolf Seefeldt. In the year 1908, young boys all around Germany began to mysteriously pass away in their sleep. And when the body of each boy was discovered, there was never any sign of external violence. But eventually, in the year 1935, when 10-year-old Heinz Zimmermann faced the same fate as all the boys before him, it was finally found that the man responsible for all these deaths was Adolf Seefeldt. Through the use of what experts suspect to have been a natural poison, Seefeldt claimed the lives of at least 12 boys over 27 years. And as a result of all of these crimes, the Nazi court sentenced Seefeldt to death by decapitation. For his final meal, Seefeldt made the simple request of 1 roasted chicken. In my opinion, chicken is great, but compared to all of the other spreads on this list, this doesn't really stack up. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Joseph Mad Dog Taborsky. In the year 1950, Taborsky and his younger brother Albert robbed a liquor store and killed the clerk in the process. When they were caught, Albert testified against his brother to lower his own sentence, but as a result, Joseph was sentenced to death. But when Albert was in prison for the part he played in the crime, he was found to be mentally disabled and sent to an insane asylum. So when Joseph heard this news, he appealed his case, and because there were no other witnesses, he was freed from death row. Then upon being released, Taborsky befriended another mentally disabled felon who was known as Meatball Cologne. Together, they embarked on a series of 6 murders, but when caught again, Taborsky was sentenced for the 2nd time to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Taborsky requested a big banana split and a cherry soda. In my opinion, banana splits are top tier when it comes to ice cream, but when it comes to entire final meal requests, I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of America's first serial killer, H.H. Holmes. In the year 1887, Holmes commissioned a massive mixed-use building in Chicago which went on to be known as the Castle. Inside, the building was equipped with trapdoors, secret passageways, and staircases that led to nowhere. Additionally, his basement contained a crematorium, dissection table, pits of quicklime, and various torture devices. So, Holmes would lure people here under false pretenses of employment, lodging, or relationships and killed anywhere between 20 and 200 total victims. And as a result of these crimes, Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging, which went wrong and left him strangling from the rope for over 15 minutes. For his final meal, Holmes requested boiled eggs, toast, and coffee. In my opinion, basically every aspect of this meal was below average, so I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the notorious English cat burglar, Charles Peace. When Peace was just 14 years old, his father died and he became permanently crippled in a factory accident. So, to support himself, he turned to crimes like petty theft and burglary. But this would all change one night when Peace was spotted by a police officer while robbing a house and shot him on sight. And Peace managed to flee the scene undetected, and this would only embolden him. So, that same year, he also went on to kill his former lover's husband and tried to kill another police officer when spotted during a separate failed burglary. Only this time, they managed to apprehend him. And even though he jumped out of the train window on his way to trial, Peace was tried and sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal, Peace requested a plate of eggs and a large amount of salty bacon. And while he also asked if he could have it with some water, this request was denied. In my opinion, bacon and eggs are an absolute classic, but as a final meal ever, it leaves a lot to be desired. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Robert Charles Comer. On February 3rd, 1987, Comer and his girlfriend Geneva Willis were camping at Apache Lake when they decided to invite a nearby camper to join them for some dinner. However, around 9 p.m., Comer shot this man in the head, stole his medical technician badge, and then hid his body. Later that night, the couple then continued on to the campsite of Jane Jones and Richard Smith, where they posed as drug enforcement agents with the stolen badge from before. Here, they tied the other couple up, robbed their campsite as well, and then kidnapped them. However, when their truck broke down as the group was fleeing the scene, Jones managed to make an escape which ultimately led to Comer and Willis's capture. As a result of these crimes, Comer was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Comer requested fried okra, 4 buns with lots of butter, lots of salt, and 2 slices of banana bread. In my opinion, this meal does a great job at crushing the fat, sugar, and carb cravings, but it struggles to compete with some of the others on the list. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Ernesto Che Guevara. During his time as a young medical student, Guevara traveled throughout South America and was deeply disturbed by the widespread poverty and hunger that ravaged these communities. So, to fight back against the capitalist exploitation by the US, which he believed was the root of these issues, he helped to facilitate the Cuban Revolution and stand up a new regime. Then, following this uprising, Guevara left Cuba to support more revolutionary efforts across Africa and South America, but was ultimately captured by CIA-assisted Bolivian forces. In the end, the Bolivian President René Barrientos ordered that he be summarily executed by a pair of Bolivian soldiers. For his final meal, Guevara was given a bowl of sopa de maní by a local 19-year-old school teacher. In my opinion, this soup was far better than I expected, but at the end of the day, it was still just soup. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Reginald Leonard Reeves. In September of 1993, 19-year-old Reeves met 14-year-old Jenny Lynn Weeks after she ran away from her foster home. Initially, the pair quickly became acquaintances, and Reeves even offered her a place to stay for the next few weeks while she got back on her feet. However, after just a few days, a witness called the police when she spotted Reeves and a friend carrying a large roll of carpet across the street and into a burned-in abandoned house. And when investigators went to that house, they found Weeks' ravaged and violated corpse stuffed into a hallway closet. In the end, Reeves turned himself in and was ultimately sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Reeves requested 4 pieces of fried chicken and 2 Coca-Colas. In my opinion, while both elements of this spread are very reliable, neither are particularly exciting. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the first person legally executed in Vermont, Emeline Meaker.
In the spring of 1879, Meaker's 8-year-old niece Alice was living in an overcrowded orphanage. So, to get her out of this situation, a childcare worker approached Meaker and her husband and asked if they'd be willing to take her into their home. And in exchange for a stipend of $400, the couple agreed to do so. However, when Alice arrived, Emeline quickly became displeased with this arrangement and decided she wanted to kill her. So on April 23rd of 1880, Emeline and her son put a sack over Alice's head, brought her out into the forest, and forced her to drink a cocktail of poison. In the end, Meaker's son testified against her, and she was ultimately sentenced to death by hanging. For her final meal, Meaker requested boiled eggs, toast, a potato, a donut, and a cup of coffee. In my opinion, the meal was a bit plain, but for the dishes included, they were all pretty solid. I'm placing this meal in C tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Dobie Gillis Williams. On the night of July 8th, 1984, Sonia Nippers woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. However, when she closed the door, she discovered a pantless man brandishing a knife. Then, as she screamed in horror, the assailant stabbed her to death and fled out the window. As a result of this crime, Williams was sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, issues with this case quickly began to arise. Not only was Williams considered mentally disabled with an IQ of 65, but also, the lawyer that represented him in trial ended up being disbarred for incompetence. And his sentencing was even eventually overturned. But due to his mitigating evidence being introduced too late into the case, Williams was still executed. For his final meal, Williams requested 12 chocolate bars and ice cream. In my opinion, this meal was definitely tasty, but the flavors included were a little bit one-note. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Harry Charles Moore. In 1992, Moore shot and killed his mother and father-in-law when they tried to interfere with his marriage between he and his niece. He claimed that he killed them out of fear that the couple would take his wife and daughter to Las Vegas and expose them to a life of prostitution and drugs. However, for these murders, Moore was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Because he wanted to get this process over with as quickly as possible, he not only petitioned against his automatic appeal, but he also threatened to sue anyone who tried stopping the execution. For his final meal, Moore requested 2 green apples, 2 red apples, a tray of fresh fruit, and 2 2-liter bottles of Coca-Cola. In my opinion, fruit tends to be a pretty slept-on pick when it comes to last meals, but this was a little bit overboard. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the man known as the Terror of Falkenhagen Lake, Friedrich Schumann. In the early 20th century, Schumann was conscripted to serve in the German army during the First World War. And over the course of his service, he was regarded as an excellent marksman and even went on to earn the 2nd-class Iron Cross. However, upon his return to civilian life, Schumann struggled to adjust, and consequently, he embarked on a series of crimes. Over the course of just 3 years, Schumann committed 5 arsons, 6 murders, and sexually violated 11 women. But after committing his last murder, Schumann was finally captured in Berlin and sentenced to death by decapitation with an axe. For his final meal, Schumann requested the classic German dishes of frikadellen and Teltu turnips. In my opinion, as an everyday meal, this spread would be great, but as a final meal ever, it leaves a bit to be desired. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of the moonshiner, car thief, and murderer, George W. Barrett. In 1930, Barrett murdered his own mother and turned himself in after his brothers placed a $500 bounty on his capture. But the result of the trial was a hung jury and he was released. However, just 5 years later, Barrett was tracked down by the FBI for car theft, where in a gunfight, he shot and killed Special Agent Nelson Klein. For his crimes, George W. Barrett was sentenced to die by hanging. The execution was carried out by a local farmer who enjoyed studying hangings as a hobby. For Barrett's final meal, he requested the largest steak in town. However, after his execution, a local reporter found Barrett's uneaten steak in the jail's kitchen. So, the man just took it and ate it himself. In my opinion, steak makes for a great component of a final meal, but alone, it leaves a bit to be desired. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of Thomas Knight. In 1974, Knight forced a Miami couple to withdraw $50,000 from the bank and then murdered them shortly after. As he was awaiting trial, he along with 10 other inmates escaped from jail and set forth on a crime spree. During this time, he murdered a store clerk in an armed robbery and was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Eventually, he was finally captured and placed on death row. But during his 39-year wait to be executed, he killed a corrections guard with a sharpened spoon, thus receiving another death sentence. For his final meal, Knight requested sweet potato pie, coconut cake, banana nut bread, 2 tablespoons of strawberries, butter pecan ice cream, vanilla ice cream, Fritos corn chips, and a quarter bottle of Sprite. In my opinion, there weren't necessarily any bad items in this spread, but I would have appreciated a few more contrasting flavors. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Juanita the Duchess Spinelli. In 1940 San Francisco, Spinelli was a gang leader who was known to pick up young homeless men off the streets. And in exchange for housing and feeding them, Spinelli would have these boys train under her to become professional criminals. And eventually, Spinelli had 2 of her protégés, Albert Ives and Robert Sherrod, perform a robbery in which they ended up shooting and killing a man. But because Spinelli feared Sherrod would confess this to the police, she proceeded to poison him, have the gang beat him while he was unconscious, and threw him over a bridge. But fearing the same would happen to him, Ives escaped and confessed to the police himself. And when Spinelli was finally caught, she was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For her final meal, Spinelli requested turkey meat and a hamburger. In my opinion, this meal is a bit below average in basically every regard. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Sedley Alley. On July 11th, 1985, 2 Marines were on a jog near Millington Naval Base when they heard a scream in the distance. And although the pair ran toward the sound, by the time they arrived, all they saw was a car driving away from the scene. Then by the next morning, the body of 19-year-old Lance Corporal Suzanne Collins was found, and the autopsy of her corpse revealed that her skull had been fractured by a screwdriver and a 31-inch tree limb had been rammed into her genitals and punctured her lungs. In the end, although significant doubts surrounded his guilt due to the court's refusal to conduct DNA testing, former Marine Sedley Alley was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Alley requested frosted oatmeal cookies, pizza pockets, ice cream, and milk. In my opinion, I'm not sure if he intended to exclusively pick items that had a kind of whitish coloration, but it certainly didn't help the spread. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Phillip Ray Workman. In 1981, Workman robbed a Wendy's restaurant in Memphis, Tennessee, but when he tried to flee the scene, he shot and killed Lieutenant Ronald Oliver. And as a result, Workman was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Workman requested 1 vegetarian pizza, but he requested that it be delivered to a homeless person instead of himself. In the end, the prison denied this request, but many locals ended up teaming together to honor Workman's final wish and donated hundreds of pizzas to homeless shelters across the community. In my opinion, vegetarian pizza wouldn't be my top choice, but sacrificing your last meal to help those in need is a respectable move. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the former Japanese Prime Minister and convicted war criminal, Hideki Tojo. Over the course of World War II, Tojo led the Japanese military in carrying out some of the most brutal atrocities in modern history. From authorizing weapons experimentation on prisoners of war to presiding over the Nanking Massacre, Tojo's leadership can be linked to the deaths of many millions of prisoners of war and civilians. But eventually, after Japan's unconditional surrender from the Second World War, Tojo was finally captured. And even though he shot himself in his chest to avoid being detained, he was resuscitated, brought to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal, Tojo requested the traditional Japanese spread of grilled fish, rice, and miso soup. In my opinion, every part of this meal was simple and tasty, but personally, I would have preferred something a little bit more exciting. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of John William Elliott. On the evening of June 13th, 1986, Elliot and 2 friends were hanging out in a driveway when they noticed 18-year-old mother Joyce Munguia waiting alone at a nearby bus stop. So, the trio invited her to join them, and after she complied, the group shared some drugs and alcohol. Then, after a few hours, Munguia had become heavily intoxicated, so she asked the men to help her get home. However, rather than bringing her back to her house, the 3 carried her under a bridge and sexually violated her. And once complete, Elliot beat her to death with a motorcycle chain. As a result of these crimes, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Elliot requested 6 chocolate chip cookies and 1 cup of hot tea. In my opinion, fresh baked chocolate chip cookies are pretty tough to beat, but even still, the spread needs some more variety. I'm placing this meal in C tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Marilyn Plantz. In the year 1988, Marilyn decided she wanted to kill her husband James to collect his $300,000 life insurance policy. So, she reached out to two of her friends to ask for their help. First, the pair planned to ambush him in his car on the way home from work, but they lost him in traffic and had to give up. So, a few weeks later, they decided to wait inside the Plantz household instead and attack James with a bat when he entered his home. And though they would succeed in this attempt, they failed to make it look like an accident like they intended. So to cover up their tracks, they forced James into a truck and burned him alive. As a result of this crime, Plantz was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Plantz requested a chicken taco salad, a Mexican pizza, 2 enchiritos, 2 chicken tacos, an order of cinnamon twists, pecan pie, and Coca-Cola. In my opinion, Taco Bell wouldn't be my first choice of fast food, let alone my final meal. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the Malaysian pop star Mona Fandey. From a young age, Fandey often performed as a dancer and singer, and eventually went on to release an album of her own. However, her career in music failed to take off, so she decided to make a pivot and become a bomo, or shaman. In this new pursuit, Fandey would offer witchcraft services to wealthy clients and politicians. But one day, things took a turn when Mona, her husband, and assistant were approached by the politician Moslin Idris, who was seeking supernatural help to boost his career. Here, the trio lured Idris into Fandey's home under the guise that they were to perform a special ritual. But once he'd entered, the group proceeded to behead him with an axe, chop him up into 18 pieces, then skinned and buried his remains. As a result of these crimes, Fandey was sentenced to death by hanging. For her final meal, Fandey was given a dinner of Kentucky Fried Chicken. In my opinion, it's hard to go wrong with KFC, but there's nothing about it that really stands out. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today we're looking at the contract killer with an IQ of 136, Stephen Wayne Anderson. In 1981, Anderson was charged with burglary, assault, 7 counts of murder, and escaping from prison. And after murdering what would be his final victim in her own home, police caught Anderson in her kitchen, eating a meal and watching television. As a result, Anderson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, he requested 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, a side of radishes, 1 pint of cottage cheese, a corn and hominy mixture, peach pie, and a pint of chocolate chip ice cream. In my opinion, the spread had solid variety, but it was a bit heavy-handed on the dairy and lacked any items I was particularly excited about. I'm placing this meal in D tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the DC sniper, John Allen Muhammad. On October the 2nd, 2002, Muhammad and his 17-year-old accomplice began a 3-week killing spree across the DC area that resulted in 10 deaths and 3 critical injuries. In each case, the pair used a holographic-sighted rifle to fire a single shot through an improvised firing port they built into the trunk of their car and then fled the scene immediately after. And while being hunted down by the authorities, the duo taunted them through leaving behind tarot cards and written demand notes for the police to find. But when they got caught sleeping at a rest stop, both men were captured and Muhammad was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Muhammad requested fried chicken with red sauce and some strawberry cakes. In my opinion, the items chosen were solid, but personally, I would have appreciated a few more dishes. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of John Fountainberry. On March 2nd, 1991, Fountainberry booked a one-way flight to Juneau, Alaska and abandoned his stolen car at the airport. Upon his arrival, he found a job at a fishing boat, but within less than 2 weeks of starting, he was fired. So that evening, he went to a local bar and struck up a conversation with a miner named Jeff Diffie who invited him back to his apartment. But when the two arrived, Fountainberry stabbed him 18 times and stole his belongings. And when he was captured, Fountainberry confessed to not only killing Jeff, but also 5 other victims as well. As a result of these crimes, Fountainberry was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Fountainberry requested wheat toast, 2 eggs, fried potatoes, bologna, bread, mayo, tomato slices and lettuce, 2 Three Musketeers bars, and 2 packages of Reese's. In my opinion, the variety and quantity were solid, but none of the dishes were that exciting. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Garden City butcher, John Martin Scripps. In March of 1995, Scripps embarked on a series of murders where he'd pose as a tourist in Thailand, befriend other Caucasian travelers, and then stay in their same hotel. Then, after checking in, he'd wait for a reason to enter their rooms, and when he did, he would use a taser to immobilize them and bashed in their skulls with a hammer.
And to make sure he wouldn't get caught, he'd chop up his victims in the hotel bathroom and then hid the bodies. However, after going on to kill at least 3 victims in 8 days, Scripps was finally captured when he arrived at the Changi airport in Singapore and his name was found on a wanted list. So, as a result of his crimes, he was sentenced by the High Court of Singapore to death by hanging. For his final meal, Scripps had the simple request of pizza and hot chocolate. In my opinion, this spread had a couple of great items. I don't know how well they synergized, and I wish there were a few sides, but I'm placing this meal in B tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Butcher of Baghdad, Saddam Hussein. In the year 1979, 42-year-old Saddam Hussein rose to power and became the dictatorial president of Iraq. Over the course of his 24-year presidency, Hussein became infamous for being particularly brutal towards his opposition. Between ordering massacres on Iraqi Shiites and Kurds, crushing political dissent, and using chemical weapons on his own people, Hussein ruled until 2003 when he was finally captured by the American Task Force 121. For his crimes against humanity, Hussein was tried in Iraqi courts and sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal, Hussein requested a traditional Iraqi spread of chicken and rice and hot water with honey. In my opinion, this meal was undoubtedly delicious, but it feels a little bit more akin to a weeknight dinner than a final meal ever. I'm placing this meal in C tier.
Today, we're taking a look at one half of the Lonely Heart Killer's Martha Beck. In the year 1946, a man named Raymond Fernandez was placed in prison for theft and his cellmate taught him the ways of voodoo and black magic, skills that Fernandez claimed gave him an irresistible charm over women. So, he decided to meet the 27-year-old Martha Beck when she placed a Lonely Hearts ad in the local newspaper. Before the pair met, Beck was a social outcast due to her appearance, so with this newfound attention, she quickly became infatuated with him and left her children behind. But soon thereafter, Beck found Fernandez in bed with another woman he was engaged to and bashed her skull in with a hammer. From then on out, the pair fled the scene, went on to kill between 2 and 16 more victims, and were captured and sentenced to death by electrocution. For her final meal, Beck requested fried chicken with no wings, french fries, and a salad. In my opinion, this spread is the epitome of average across the board. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the presidential assassin Charles Julius Guiteau. In the year 1880, Guiteau considered himself a loyal Republican and was convinced he played a critical role in the election of James A. Garfield as the 20th US president. While in reality, the only substantive contributions he made were a few small speeches to disinterested crowds in New York, Guiteau believed that this should entitle him to be rewarded with a consulship in Europe. But when his applications for these positions were declined, Guiteau felt betrayed and swore to seek revenge. So he waited for President Garfield at the train station and shot him on sight. As a result of this crime, Guiteau was sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal, Guiteau requested a pound of broiled steak, fried potatoes, 4 slices of toast, and 1 quart of coffee. In my opinion, you can't go wrong with this meal, but for a final spread, it's certainly nothing special. I'm placing this meal in C tier.
Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Carol Cole. During Cole's childhood, his father went to fight in World War II, so he remained home with his mother and was forced to watch as she regularly brought home men. To keep this a secret, Cole's mother often beat him into silence, which sowed the seeds of hatred towards women that would last him for the rest of his life. Eventually, this would lead to Cole killing any woman he deemed as promiscuous. So, over the course of 9 years, Cole would meet women at the bar for intercourse, and while he let most of them go, he'd kill those that he claimed were loose. In the end, Cole claimed the lives of at least 14 women before finally being captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Cole requested jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, a salad, and Boston clam chowder. In my opinion, I think the spread was certainly delicious, but there's nothing about it that was particularly special. I'm placing this meal in B tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Stacy Lamont Lawton. On Christmas Eve of 1992, Lawton and 2 of his friends were conducting a spree of car robberies. But eventually they came across the house of 47-year-old Dennis Price. Upon their arrival, Price's daughter heard them breaking into the family's car and rushed to tell her father what was occurring. But when Price exited his home to confront the robbers, Lawton shot him in the chest with a shotgun and then fled the scene in a stolen truck with his accomplices. Shortly thereafter, Price died in the arms of his daughter as she tried to give him CPR. As for the criminals, all 3 were captured in a high-speed chase, and when his accomplices testified against him, Lawton was sentenced to death by lethal injection. injection. For his final meal, Lawton requested a cheeseburger, a side of fries, and an entire jar of dill pickles. In my opinion, I love every aspect of this meal, but there's nothing really special about this spread compared to all the others, so I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Bobby Joe Long. Throughout his childhood, Long had to watch as his mother regularly brought home new men when she came home from work as a cocktail waitress. This, paired with numerous head injuries and him developing breast due to a genetic disorder, all contributed to a tumultuous childhood. Eventually, due to struggles with his identity and relationship, Long began answering newspaper ads to identify targets and sexually violate them. However, in 1984, Long's crimes further escalated when he embarked on an 8-month spree of abducting, sexually violating, and murdering at least 10 different women. But then, when 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh survived his attack and reported it to the police, Long was captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Long requested roast beef, bacon, French fries, and soda. In my opinion, out of all the protein choices you could select, roast beef would not be very high on my list. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of John Joubert. On August 22, 1982, 11-year-old Ricky Stetson went on a jog but strangely disappeared. However, the next morning, his corpse was found in a ditch, undressed, stabbed, strangled, and bitten. Unfortunately, this case quickly went cold due to a lack of evidence. But then, around 1,500 miles away, another 13-year-old boy was discovered deceased under similar circumstances about a year later, and a 12-year-old boy was found with his throat slit so severely he was almost decapitated. In the end, physical evidence and FBI profiling led to Joubert's capture, and he was ultimately sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Joubert requested a cheese pizza with green peppers and onions, strawberry cheesecake, and Coca-Cola. In my opinion, this meal is pretty solid across the board, but there's nothing about it that really stands out. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Mary Blandy. In the year 1746, Blandy was a well-mannered and educated 26-year-old woman who came from a respected middle-class English family. At the time, she met and fell in love with the son of a Scottish nobleman named Captain William Henry Cranston and decided she wanted to marry him. However, because it was revealed that Cranston was already married and had a child in Scotland, Blandy's father disapproved of their marriage. So, Mary decided to give her father what she claimed to think was a love potion that would make him approve of the marriage. However, in reality, this potion was just arsenic, and her father died as a result. In the end, after a 13-hour trial, Blandy was sentenced to death by hanging. For her final meal, Blandy requested mutton chops and apple pie. In my opinion, if I ranked these meals respective of time period, this would be S tier, but I don't. So, I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Gilbert Ray Postel. In the year 2004, Gilbert's father Brad got into a serious motorcycle accident which left him with severe injuries to his body and brain. So, roughly a year after this crash, Gilbert and 3 accomplices decided they wanted to enact revenge. So on the night of May 30th, 2005, the group launched a so-called blitz attack on the home of those they thought responsible for the accident. During this ambush, the group stormed into the house, forced the 4 people inside to kneel in their yard, and proceeded to gun them down with an AK-47. As a result of these crimes, Gilbert was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Postel requested 20 chicken nuggets, 3 large fries, a crispy chicken sandwich, a regular chicken sandwich, a large Coke, and a caramel frappe. In my opinion, this is a great spread to order from McDonald's, but it's not quite as great for your final meal ever. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of John David Duty. On December 19, 2001, Duty was serving out a life sentence at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary when prison officials assigned 22-year-old Curtis Wise to be his new cellmate. Then, just 6 days later, in exchange for a few cigarettes, Duty asked Wise to convince the guards that he was being held hostage. However, after Duty tied Wise up, he strangled him to death with a shoelace and then wrote a letter to the boy's mother. And when he was brought to trial, Duty requested the death penalty and vowed to kill again if he wasn't executed. In the end, Duty's wishes were granted and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Duty requested a double cheeseburger with mayo, a foot-long hot dog with cheese, mustard, and onions, a banana shake, and cherry limeade. In my opinion, the spread had a few pretty niche picks, but overall, it didn't stand out. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Robert Lee Massey. At the age of just 17, Massey had his first run-in with the law when he was put in prison for car theft. However, while he was behind bars, he suffered a sexual assault so severe he decided to feign insanity and be submitted to a psychiatric facility. But once he got released, he resumed his life of crime and eventually went on to kill Mildred Weiss in front of her own home. And when he was captured for this crime, Massey was sentenced to death. However, his execution ended up being stayed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, and he was paroled just 6 years later. But then, within less than a year of being out of jail, Massey committed another murder and was again sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Massey requested French fries, fried oysters, soft drinks, and 2 vanilla milkshakes. In my opinion, fried oysters wouldn't have been my first choice of entree, but the overall spread wasn't bad. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Ignacio Cuevas. On July 24th, 1974, Cuevas was serving a 45-year sentence for murder at the Huntsville prison when he and 2 other inmates decided they wanted to escape. So, the group bribed a prison worker to smuggle in guns and ammunition, and then they mounted an 11-day siege on the prison library and took 16 hostages. However, when the trio and 4 of their hostages made a break to a getaway vehicle, they ended up facing resistance, so they shot and killed 2 of their hostages along the way. In the end, the escape was unsuccessful. Both his accomplices died, and Cuevas was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Cuevas requested chicken and dumplings, steamed rice, sliced bread, black-eyed peas, and iced tea. In my opinion, this spread is great for a standard dinner, but for a final meal, it's pretty average. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of the familicidal serial killer Rhonda Bell Martin. From the years of 1937 to 1951, Martin admitted to poisoning her mother, 2 of her husbands, and 3 of her 5 children. Eventually, she also attempted to murder her 5th husband and former stepson, but he survived the poison and was left paralyzed. When she was finally caught, the state of Alabama sentenced Martin to death by electrocution. For her final meal, she requested mashed potatoes, a hamburger, cinnamon rolls, and a coffee. In my opinion, the spread was balanced pretty well. There might not have been an X factor, but every item held its own. For that, I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Kenneth Lee Boyd. In the year 1975, Boyd began what would become an incredibly tumultuous 13-year marriage with his wife Julie Curry. Their relationship was marred with physical abuse, numerous separations, and stalking until things eventually reached a violent climax on March 4th of 1988. On this day, Boyd drove with his sons to the home of his father-in-law where Julie and his children were staying. Upon his arrival, Boyd entered the house and began shooting, and though his sons tried to stop him, he eventually killed Julie and her father. And after calling the police to turn himself in, Boyd was tried and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Boyd requested a medium-well New York strip, a baked potato with sour cream, a roll with butter, a salad with ranch, and a Pepsi. In my opinion, this is a super classic spread, but it could have used some dessert. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Timothy Evans. In the year 1948, Timothy Evans and Beryl Thorley got married but regularly quarreled and faced significant financial issues. So when Beryl revealed she was pregnant with a second child, the pair agreed to abort it. However, because abortion was illegal in the UK at the time, their downstairs neighbor John Christie volunteered to perform the procedure for them. But during this process, Beryl passed away, and when Timothy was interrogated on this case, he was coerced into falsely confessing and thus was sentenced to death by hanging. However, 3 years after Evans was executed, their downstairs neighbor John Christie was discovered to be a serial killer and had confessed to killing 6 victims, including Beryl Thorley. Therefore, Evans was posthumously pardoned. For his final meal, Evans requested steak, eggs, chips, and beer. In my opinion, this spread did have some solid items, but it was a little lacking in variety. I'm placing this meal in B tier. And today, we're checking out the menu of the notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy. In 1979, Bundy received his first death sentence for the murder of 2 college students, and a year later, he received another for the heinous crimes he committed against a 12-year-old girl. However, it's estimated that Bundy could have been responsible for up to hundreds of other deaths beyond these cases. And in the very end, Bundy declined his privilege of selecting a special meal, so he was instead given the traditional final spread of steak cooked medium rare, hash browns, eggs over easy, toast with butter and jelly, juice, and milk. In my opinion, this spread had tons of variety and was super delicious. And honestly, I think this should be the basis by which all other final meals are judged. Therefore, I'm ranking this at the top of C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the night caller Eric Edgar Cook. Between the years of 1958 and 63, Cook carried out a series of what seemed to be unrelated hit and runs throughout Perth, Western Australia. In each different case, Cook used a wide variety of weapons including knives, scissors, guns, an axe, a car, and even his bare hands. Sometimes, he would kill his victims when they caught him robbing their home. In others, he simply shot them dead when they answered their door. So due to this inconsistency across the 8 total murders, this led to a police investigation whereby more than 30,000 people were fingerprinted and 60,000 rifles were tested. In the end, this investigation was ultimately successful and Cook was captured and sentenced to death by hanging. For his final meal, Cook requested steak, eggs, chips, and peaches and cream. In my opinion, this meal was fairly simple, but each element definitely pulled its weight. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the individual once known as the most hated man in the world, Bruno Hauptmann. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, Hauptmann kidnapped the son of the famous American aviator Charles Lindbergh from his home. Upon investigation, authorities found a homemade ladder under the window of the child's room, a ransom note for $50,000, and even the corpse of the infant child. But they still couldn't identify the perpetrator. Then when the case was at a seeming dead end, the FBI received a tip and used it to track Hauptmann down. And though Hauptmann realized he was being followed and tried to flee, he was captured and sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Hauptmann requested buttered peas, celery, chicken, french fries, cherries, olives, and a slice of cake. In my opinion, I'm normally a big fan of variety, but in this spread, some of the dishes were a bit questionable. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Walter Leroy Moody. On December 16, 1989, federal appeals judge Robert Vance was sitting in his kitchen when he began to open up a package he received in the mail. But just as he did so, there was a homemade pipe bomb inside the box that exploded, which killed him instantly and critically wounded his wife. Then, just 48 hours later, it happened again, thus killing attorney Robert Robinson as well. Although the search for the perpetrator was initially fruitless, an explosives expert recalled the striking similarity between these bombs and one he helped defuse 17 years prior, the maker of which was Walter Moody. So when the evidence mounted against him, Moody was sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Moody requested 2 Philly cheesesteaks, a bag of chips, 2 Dr. Peppers, a bag of M&Ms, and an almond Hershey bar. In my opinion, Philly cheesesteaks are scrumptious, but nothing else in this spread really stood out. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of the serial killer known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, Peter Kürten. During the early 1900s, Kürten grew to be one of the deadliest serial killers in German history. While he was at large, it's stated that he committed a total of 68 crimes, including 9 murders and the attempt of 31 more. And while the motive for this rampage was unclear, Kürten was known for achieving immense sexual gratification from the bloodshed. Eventually, after 16 years of murders and over 13,000 letters from the public to the Dusseldorf police, Peter Kürten turned himself into the authorities, took responsibility for all of his crimes, and was sentenced to death by way of the guillotine. For his final meal, Kürten requested Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes. And upon finishing, he even requested a second helping, which the prison granted. In my opinion, the meal was pretty simple, but it was tasty, comforting, and left me nothing to complain about. So I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Jimmy L. Glass. On Christmas Eve of 1982, Glass and his friend Jimmy Wingo were serving out prison sentences at the Webster Parish Jail when they decided they wanted to make their escape. So, when they were left unattended while making calls to their families, the two took advantage, went down the elevator, and exited the compound. However, less than 24 hours after escaping, the pair broke into a nearby residence. Here, the two men threw a cinder block through a window, stormed inside, and executed Aileen and Newton Brown in their bed. As a result of these crimes, both men were captured and sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Glass requested a pepperoni pizza, a chef's salad with blue cheese dressing, fresh peaches and cream, and 2 soft drinks. In my opinion, this meal is pretty well-rounded, but there's nothing about it that's particularly special. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of Alan Lee Davis. Davis. On the night of May 11th, 1982, Davis broke into the Weiler family home where he shot and killed the two young daughters and then proceeded to beat the pregnant mother to death with his pistol. As a result, Davis was sentenced to death by electrocution. And while complications led to significant nose bleeding, his execution was ultimately successful. For his final meal, Alan Lee Davis requested a lobster tail, fried potatoes, half a pound of fried shrimp, 6 ounces of fried clams, half a loaf of garlic bread, and 32 ounces of A&W root beer. In my opinion, the quality of dishes chosen was great, but when it comes to variety, this spread left quite a bit to be desired. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Kenneth Wayne Morris. On the early morning hours of May 1st, 1991, Morris and 2 accomplices kicked in the door of the Adams family's home. Here, after being awoken by the sound of this intrusion, 63-year-old James Adams went to see what was going on. But when he did so, the 3 men confronted him at gunpoint and demanded he give them all the money he had. But even when he complied and emptied his wallet for the 3 men, they decided to shoot him 4 times anyway. This would cause Adams to collapse into his closet and die at the feet of his hiding wife. As a result of this crime, Morris was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Morris requested fried chicken, fried okra, a cake, and lemonade. And in the end, Morris was executed on his 38th birthday. In my opinion, these probably aren't the dishes I would have selected, but overall, the meal wasn't too bad. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Gainesville Ripper, Danny Rawling. During the early hours of August 24th, 1990, Rawling broke into the apartment of 2 sleeping university students, and once inside, he killed each girl one by one by taping their mouths shut to muffle their screams and stabbing them to death. Then, over the following few days, Rawling continued on and killed 3 more students in a similar fashion. One disturbing thread across almost all of these cases was that Rawling would leave the corpses in either sexual or disturbing positions with the goal of shocking whomever discovers the body. And even after all of this, Rawling managed to flee the campus undetected and was on the run for over 2 months before being captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Rawling requested a lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, a baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. In my opinion, this spread was solid, but compared to all the others on this list, it didn't stand out. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today we're getting started with Ricky Ray Rector. In 1981, Rector was charged with the murders of Arthur Criswell and police officer Robert Martin. As a result, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For Rector's final meal, he requested steak, fried chicken, pecan pie, and cherry Kool-Aid. However, Rector chose not to eat the pecan pie, claiming to the guards that he was saving it for later. The pie was left on his tray and not disposed of until the execution had been completed. In my opinion, the meal was loaded up with some classics, but I would have liked to see some sides and maybe a better choice in drink. I'm placing this meal in C tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Francis Two Gun Crowley. In the year 1931, 18-year-old Crowley went on a killing spree that would lead up to one of the largest showdowns in the history of New York City. After being tracked down to a 5th-floor Manhattan apartment, Crowley was surrounded by 300 police officers armed with rifles, machine guns, and tear gas. Then, over the course of the 2-hour siege, over 15,000 spectators gathered to watch the police fire over 700 rounds into Crowley's apartment. And in the end, Crowley was captured after being shot 4 times and sentenced to death by electrocution. For his final meal, Crowley requested steak with onions, French fries, ice cream, melted ice cream, and apple pie. In my opinion, even though this is one of the better meals I've had from this time period, I still would have liked a little bit more quantity. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Cleve Foster. On February 13th, 2002, Foster and his friend Sheldon Ward were hanging out at a local bar when they met 30-year-old Mary Powell. Over the course of the night, the majority of the group's conversation took place between Ward and Powell until the bar eventually closed around 2 a.m. Then after just a few more minutes of conversation in the parking lot, Powell left in her car and the men followed closely behind her. However, just 8 hours later, Powell's nude and violated corpse was discovered in a ditch with a gunshot wound to the head. In the end, though Ward claimed that he was the sole one responsible for these acts, both men were found guilty by DNA testing and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For Foster's final meal, he requested 2 fried chickens, French fries, and a 5-gallon bucket of peaches. In my opinion, I'm a big fan of the salty sweet vibe, but I do wish there were a few more flavors in the mix. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Michael Anthony Rodriguez.
months. In the year 2000, 7 inmates were being held in a maximum security prison when they decided they wanted to make their escape. So, on the morning of December 13th, the group proceeded to subdue 16 prison staff and inmates, steal weapons from the guard tower, and flee from the compound in a stolen truck. Once they were free, the group then embarked on a series of crimes. Here, they robbed numerous stores, stole multiple cars, and even killed a police officer. In the end, the group was recaptured and all surviving members were sentenced to death by lethal injection. The first of the group to be executed was Michael Anthony Rodriguez, and his final meal was a spicy chicken breast, a grilled pork steak, a bacon cheeseburger, a garden salad, and french fries. In my opinion, this spread had plenty of good variety, but I wish it also included something sweet. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Jeffrey David Matthews. On the morning of January 27th, 1994, Minnie Short was awakened after hearing a noise in her home, and when she went to investigate the source, she found standing in her living room 20-year-old Tracy Dyer, who sprang upon her and slit her throat. Then, when her husband followed in next, his great-nephew Jeffrey David Matthews, who was also the second intruder, shot him in the head and proceeded to rob the house. However, after the two men escaped the scene, Short got up despite her neck wounds and walked down the street to get help. In the end, Short survived the attack, both men were captured, and Matthews was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Matthews requested a deep dish meat lover's pizza, deep fried jumbo shrimp, and hush puppies. In my opinion, I'm not sure if this spread had the best synergy, but each of the items involved were individually solid. I'm placing this meal in B tier.
Today, we're looking at the selection of the infamous killer clown, John Wayne Gacy. In 1972, Gacy began the longest string of killings in U.S. history to that point. Over this 4-year stretch, Gacy was known for tricking his victims into entering his home, then proceeding to torture, violate, and ultimately murder them. After claiming the lives of 33 young men, Gacy was finally caught and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Gacy requested 1 dozen fried shrimp, a side of fries, 1 pound of strawberries, a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and a Diet Coke. In my opinion, the spread was definitely on the decadent side, but it had nice variety and a pretty solid quantity of food. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Perry Edward Smith. On the evening of November 14th, 1959, Smith and his partner Richard Hickok snuck into the home of the Clutter family. The pair chose this house specifically because Smith's former cellmate in prison told him he used to work there as a farmhand, and the family had a safe filled with $10,000. However, after they searched the house, the duo not only ended up waking up the family, but it also became evident that said safe didn't exist. So, the two men decided to bind and gag the family of 4 and violently murder them one by one. And although the pair managed to evade authorities for over 6 weeks, both men were eventually captured and sentenced to death by hanging. For Smith's final meal, he requested spiced shrimp, fries, garlic bread, strawberries with whipped cream, and ice cream. In my opinion, this spread had a solid collection of dishes and the variety wasn't bad. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today we're looking at the selection of the man who requested a movie with his last meal, Ronnie Lee Gardner. In 1984, Gardner was arrested for murdering a bartender during his robbery of a Salt Lake City tavern. But when sent to court for his hearing, he attempted to escape the courthouse. And as he was trying to flee, he shot and killed an attorney who was doing pro bono work for his church. For this crime, Gardner was sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, because of his Mormon heritage, he opted to be executed by firing squad instead. For his final meal, Gardner requested steak, lobster, apple pie with ice cream, and to eat it all while watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In my opinion, steak and lobster doesn't feel like a very comforting final meal choice, but I will say the movie's a nice touch. I'm placing this meal in B tier.
Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Ruth Snyder. In the year 1915, 20-year-old Ruth married a 33-year-old artist named Albert Snyder. However, in the years following their marriage, things quickly began to go downhill. According to some theories, Ruth's resentment for Albert began when he hung up a picture of his late wife, named his boat after her, and described her as the finest woman he had ever met. So as revenge, Ruth persuaded Albert to purchase a life insurance policy that paid extra in the case of an unexpected act of violence. Then, Ruth made
made 7 failed attempts to kill him, but eventually succeeded by staging a burglary and strangling him with a picture wire. When she was caught, Ruth was sentenced to death by electrocution. For her final meal, Ruth requested chicken parmesan with Alfredo pasta, 2 milkshakes, ice cream, and a 12-pack of grape soda. In my opinion, though most of the meal was average, the pasta dish was top-notch. I'm placing this meal in B tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of Thomas J. Grasso. On December 24th, 1990, Grasso strangled his 87-year-old neighbor to death using the Christmas lights of her Tulsa home. He then proceeded to steal her purse, some loose change, and a television set. And although Grasso went on to commit another murder before being caught, it was for this one that he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Grasso requested a double cheeseburger, half a dozen barbecue spare ribs, 1/2 pumpkin pie with diced strawberries and whipped cream, 2 dozen each of steamed clams and mussels, 2 strawberry milkshakes, and 1 can of SpaghettiOs. But less than an hour before his execution, he issued his final statement claiming, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." In my opinion, these are probably not the dishes I would have chosen, but when it comes to variety, this meal did not disappoint. I'm placing this meal in A tier.
Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the glamour girl slayer, Harvey Glatman. In the year 1957, 30-year-old Glatman moved to Los Angeles, California, where he began to pose as a professional photographer. In doing so, he would lure in aspiring models to his apartment by offering them promises of work. However, once they'd arrive, Glatman would proceed to tie each woman up, take photos of her once she's been bound, and then sexually violate her. And to ensure they wouldn't tell, he'd strangle them to death, then dump their bodies in the desert. In the end, while in the process of trying to kidnap his 4th victim, Glatman was arrested by the police and ultimately sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For his final meal, Glatman requested a shrimp cocktail, a rare T-bone steak, french fries, soda, and a banana split. In my opinion, I'm not the biggest fan of rare steak, but aside from that, this was a solid and balanced spread. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Charles Rhines. In February of 1992, Rhines was fired from his job as a night baker at a local donut shop for failing to follow orders. However, just a few weeks after his dismissal, he ran out of money and decided he wanted to go and burglarize the shop. So, using a copy of the backdoor key, Rhines broke in. But then, when 22-year-old Donovan Schaefer, who was a current employee, came to pick up some supplies, Rhines immediately ambushed him and stabbed him in the stomach. And though Schaefer promised to be silent about the crimes if Rhines would bring him to a hospital, Rhines instead forced him into a storeroom and stabbed him to death. As a result of these crimes, Rhines was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Rhines requested fried chicken, cantaloupe, lefse, yogurt, black licorice, ice cream, root beer, and coffee. In my opinion, this was a pretty eclectic spread, and it hit on a ton of the notes I was looking for. I'm placing this meal in A tier.
Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the freeway strangler, William Bonin. In the year 1979, Bonin stalked the highways of Southern California and would lure teenage boys into his van. However, once inside, Bonin would bind the boys by their wrists and ankles, forcibly violate them, and then brutally take their lives. But eventually the police caught on to this act, and one day they trailed Bonin's vehicle into a gas station parking lot and caught him while in the act of violating a 17-year-old boy. Over his year at large, Bonin killed anywhere between 14 and 44 boys, and for these crimes, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Bonin requested 2 sausage and pepperoni pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 6-packs of Coca-Cola. In my opinion, I'm a fan of all the items in this spread, but personally, I would have preferred a little bit more variety. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the man who claimed he was too fat to be executed, Brian Dorsey. On December 23, 2006, Dorsey called his cousin Sarah to ask if he could borrow money to pay off his drug debt, but unfortunately, she declined. So, Dorsey waited until later that night when Sarah and her husband were sleeping. Then, he entered their home through their garage, stole a shotgun, and fatally shot them both. But before he left, Brian first violated Sarah's corpse and then proceeded to steal jewelry and their car. In the end, despite arguments that the overweight Brian Dorsey was too obese to humanely execute, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Dorsey requested 2 double bacon cheeseburgers, 2 large orders of fries, 2 orders of chicken strips, and 1 5-topping pizza. In my opinion, every item in this spread was super satisfying, but some contrasting flavors would have been nice. I'm placing this meal in A tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Christina Marie Riggs. On the night of November 4th, 1997, Riggs put both of her kids to bed, but tonight she gave them both some sedatives first to ensure they'd be sound asleep for her sinister plan. Then, once they finally dozed off, Riggs began by injecting her son with some stolen potassium chloride, the same toxic chemical used to perform lethal injections. However, this drug failed to kill him, so when the 5-year-old boy woke up in a state of terror, she smothered him with a pillow and then did the same to his 2-year-old sister. And although she then tried ingesting 28 sedative tablets to take her own life as well, this attempt failed and Riggs was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For her final meal, Riggs requested a supreme pizza, salad, pickled okra, strawberry shortcake, and cherry limeade. In my opinion, the spread wasn't anything special, but it definitely was solid all around. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Phantom Hobo Killer, Lloyd Gomez. Growing up, Gomez lacked a formal education and regularly found himself in and out of jail. However, this didn't deter him from continuing his life of crime, and between the years of 1950 and 51, Gomez set out on a killing spree. Primarily targeting vagrants living in hobo jungles along railroad tracks, Gomez would typically murder his victims through crushing their heads with large rocks or other blunt objects. In the end, Gomez was captured for an unrelated burglary, but during questioning, spontaneously confessed to killing 9 total victims. As a result of these crimes, Gomez was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For his final meal, Gomez requested fried chicken, fried potatoes, peas, a tomato and lettuce salad, toast, apple pie, and coffee. In my opinion, this meal was super well-rounded, but it doesn't quite stand out as elite. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Gary Carl Simmons. On August 11th, 1996, Jeffrey Wolf and his girlfriend Charlene Leeser drove from Texas to Mississippi to collect a drug debt owed by Simmons and his former brother-in-law Timothy Milano. However, upon arriving at Simmons' house, an argument between the two parties ensued, and Milano proceeded to shoot and kill Wolf, and Simmons imprisoned Leeser and sexually violated her. But she eventually escaped and reported them to the police. In the end, Simmons was captured and ultimately sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Simmons requested 2 custom Pizza Hut pizzas, 80 ounces of Parmesan cheese, 80 ounces of ranch dressing, Doritos, nacho cheese, jalapenos, shakes, ice cream, 2 20-ounce cherry cokes, and a supersized order of McDonald's fries. In my opinion, there was a ton of quantity and decent variety, but some of the items chosen were kinda mid. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Thomas Martin Thompson. On September 11th, 1981, Thompson, his roommate, and Ginger Fleischle were on a night out in Laguna Beach, California. Over the course of the evening, the group went bar hopping and smoked marijuana until eventually calling it a night. But then, Thompson brought Fleischle back to his apartment where he proceeded to sexually violate her, stab her 5 times in the head, then bury her body in a nearby field. When Fleischle's body was discovered just 3 days later, forensic evidence led to Thompson's capture. And though the case was mired in controversy, Thompson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Thompson requested Alaskan king crab, spinach salad, pork fried rice, Mandarin-style spare ribs, a hot fudge sundae, and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola. In my opinion, this spread not only has a nice selection of dishes, but also solid variety and quantity. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Robert Alton Harris. In the year 1978, Harris asked his 16-year-old brother Daniel to help him rob a bank. However, the pair lacked a getaway vehicle and had to steal one on the way to the robbery. So on July 5th of 1978, the brothers approached a pair of teenagers eating hamburgers in their car and demanded they drive them out to a remote area. But once they did so, Harris executed them both and stole their car. But within less than an hour of carrying out the robbery, Harris and his brother were captured, and the arresting officer was the father of one of the young boys the brothers had killed. As a result of his crimes, Harris was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For his final meal, Harris requested KFC, 2 Domino's pizzas, ice cream, a bag of jelly beans, a 6-pack of Pepsi, and a pack of Camel cigarettes. In my opinion, this meal was strong all around, but I wish the quantity would have been spread across a few more items. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Clarence Ray Allen. In the year 1974, Clarence began his criminal career when he and his son robbed a local market run by Ray and Fran Schledowitz. However, Alan's son eventually told his girlfriend Mary Sue Kitts about the robbery, and she would go on to tell the couple the Allens were responsible. So, to get his revenge, Clarence ordered a hit on Kitts, and she was strangled and thrown into a canal. Then, when he was in prison serving a life sentence for this crime, Clarence ordered an attack that would result in a total of 3 more deaths. In the end, these 3 murders were carried out successfully, and Allen was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Allen requested a buffalo steak, fry bread, Kentucky Fried Chicken, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free black walnut ice cream, and whole milk. In my opinion, all these dishes were spectacular, and my only complaint is that I wish there were some more sides. I'm placing this meal in A tier.
Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Walter Bernhardt Legrand. On the morning of January 7th, 1982, Walter and his brother entered a bank armed with a toy gun and demanded the branch manager to open up the vault. However, because he only possessed half of the code necessary to do so, the brothers mercilessly beat him and another employee and then stabbed him 24 times to his death with a letter opener. As a result of these crimes, Legrand was sentenced to death by asphyxiation gas. For his final meal, Legrand requested 6 fried eggs, 16 strips of bacon, a large portion of hash browns, a pint of pineapple sherbet ice cream, a well-done breakfast steak, a cup of ice with 1 each of Coke, 7-Up, and Dr. Pepper, coffee with 2 sugars, and 4 tablets of Rolaids. In my opinion, I'm already a big breakfast guy, so between the fat portions and unique add-ons, I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the Mad Dog Killer, Marion Albert Pruitt. After testifying on a murder case in 1979, Pruitt was placed in the Witness Protection Program, where he was given a new name and $800. However, rather than going into hiding with this new identity, he used this alias to embark on a spree of crimes. And in a series of murders that would go on to be known as the Mad Dog Killings, Pruitt robbed and killed 3 convenience store workers, a bank teller, and his common-law wife, all to feed his severe cocaine addiction. And as a result of these crimes, Pruitt was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Pruitt requested a stuffed crust pizza, 4 Burger King Whoppers, French fries, fried squash, okra, an eggplant, a whole pecan pie, and 3 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. In my opinion, this spread had plenty of quantity, but it was a tad bit greasy for my preference. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Andrew H. Brannon. On January 12, 1998, Deputy Kyle Dinkheller stopped Andrew Brannon when he was speeding down the highway at 98 miles an hour. At first, the traffic stop was nothing out of the ordinary. However, Brannon soon began refusing to take his hands out of his pockets, screaming at the officer to shoot him, and dancing in the middle of the road. And though Dinkheller continued trying to get him to comply, Brannon went to his truck to grab his M1 carbine, shouted that he was a quote, goddamn Vietnam combat veteran, and shot Dinkheller 10 times, resulting in his death. Because of these crimes, Brannon was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Brannon requested 3 over-easy eggs, hash browns, biscuits and gravy, sausage, pecan waffles with strawberries, milk, apple juice, and decaffeinated coffee. In my opinion, I wish there was a little bit more protein, but overall, this spread was solid. I'm placing this meal in A tier. I'm rating every death row final meal request to find out which one's the greatest of all time. Today, we're looking at the selection of the man who argued he was too obese to be executed, Richard Cooey. In 1986, Cooey and 2 of his friends were throwing chunks of concrete off a bridge until one eventually connected with the passing vehicle of 2 local university students. Upon impacting their vehicle, the group of boys pretended to come to their aid, but before long, they went on to kidnap the 2 girls and proceeded to torture, stab, and violate them for 3.5 hours until their deaths. For his crimes, Richard Cooey was sentenced to death by lethal injection. And although his lawyers argued he was too obese to be executed, this argument was ultimately rejected. For his final meal, Cooey requested a T-bone steak, onion rings, French fries, 4 fried eggs, buttered toast, hash browns, a bucket of Rocky Road ice cream, Bear Claw pastries, and a bottle of Mountain Dew. In my opinion, this spread had lots of the best elements from the other meals and more. For that, I'm placing this meal in high A tier. Today, we are looking at the selection of the former King of France, Louis XVI. During the late 18th century, France was embroiled in what we now know as the French Revolution, and because of this movement, the country abolished the monarchy, thus ending the reign of Louis XVI. However, after this happened, it was alleged that Louis made several different attempts to undermine the revolution to regain his former power. But in doing so, he was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death by way of the guillotine. And when the blade fell, many members of the crowd pushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood as a souvenir. For his final meal, Louis requested a pan-fried chicken, some pastries, boiled beef, and pureed turnips. Additionally, he requested the accompanying dessert of 2 chicken wings, vegetables, a piece of sponge cake, 2 glasses of wine cut with water, and a glass of Malaga wine. In my opinion, the spread was really solid. Nothing particularly stood out, but it was well balanced and each dish held its own. So, I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Manuel Pardo Jr. In 1978, Pardo was just 21 years old when he began his career in law enforcement. However, this didn't last long. Within less than a year of starting, he was forced to resign when caught falsifying more than 100 traffic tickets, then got hired at a new station, but again was fired for this time lying to investigators. So when fighting crime didn't seem to work for him, Pardo decided to start committing it. And over the course of the next 4 months, he went on a spree of murder robberies and ultimately claimed the lives of 9 total victims. In the end, Pardo was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Pardo requested roasted pork, red beans, rice, plantains, tomato and avocado, olive oil, pumpkin pie, eggnog, and Cuban coffee. In my opinion, when it comes to selection, cohesion, and variety, this spread killed it. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of James Lewis Jackson. In the year 1997, Jackson struggled to maintain his marriage, and it quickly became evident that his wife Sharon was intending to divorce him. So one day, when each of Jackson's stepdaughters came home from school, he asked them how they felt about their mother's intentions. The younger of his 2 stepdaughters got home first, so when she expressed ambivalence about the divorce, he strangled her to death. After that, the second of 2 stepdaughters came home too, and the result was the same. And finally, when he went to go pick up Sharon from work, he strangled her as well and then tucked all of their bodies into their beds. As a result of these crimes, Jackson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Jackson requested fried chicken, fried okra, french fries, salad, hard-boiled eggs with cheese, 2 Cokes, butter pecan ice cream, and 2 honey buns. In my opinion, though some of the dishes could have been better, this spread had a solid selection. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of the Candyman, Ronald Clark O'Brien. On Halloween of 1974, O'Brien took his children out for a night of trick-or-treating, and when the festivities came to an end, he brought out 5 tubes of pixie sticks to give to his kids and the other neighborhood children. And though none of the other children ended up eating any, Ronald's son Timothy did. But shortly after trying it out, Timothy began to convulse and vomit, and as Ronald held him in his arms, his body went limp and he died shortly thereafter. In the end, it was found that Ronald had laced this candy with cyanide, also he could collect an insurance claim on the life of his son, and thus he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, O'Brien requested a T-bone steak, french fries, corn, sweet peas, rolls, saltines, a salad, iced tea, and a Boston cream pie. In my opinion, though the spread had pretty standard dishes, the amount of quantity and variety was solid. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of Richard Michael Cartwright. On August 1st, 1996, Cartwright and 2 of his friends planned to pose as male prostitutes and rob a gay man, a target they felt would be unlikely to report them. So, the group lured in 37-year-old Nick Merida by inviting him to drink at a nearby park. However, when the group arrived, the trio brandished a gun and knife and demanded he give them all his money. But when he refused and tried to flee, one of the men tried to stab him but failed to kill him, so Cartwright shot him in the back. And when both his accomplices testified against him, Cartwright was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Cartwright requested fried chicken, a cheeseburger, french fries, onion rings, bacon and sausage, cheesecake, and cinnamon rolls. In my opinion, when any spread has multiple entrees, sides, and desserts, it's pretty tough to go wrong. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are taking a look at the selection of the last man publicly executed in the US, Rainey Bethia. On the morning of June 7th, 1936, Bethia snuck into the home of 70-year-old Lashia Edwards by climbing through her bedroom window. However, when he removed the window screen and entered into her room, this woke Edwards up. So when she looked up and saw Bethia, he choked her to death, brutally violated her, and stole her jewelry. But as he was fleeing the scene, he accidentally left a ring behind that would ultimately lead to his capture.
In the end, Bethia provided a detailed confession of his guilt and was publicly hung before a crowd of 20,000 spectators. For his final meal, Bethia requested fried chicken, pork chops, mashed potatoes, pickled cucumbers, cornbread, lemon pie, and ice cream. In my opinion, between the multiple entrees, sides, and desserts, this spread was packed with some bangers. I'm placing this meal in A tier. Today, we are looking at the selection of Joseph Mitchell Parsons. On the night of August 30th, 1987, Parsons was picked up as a hitchhiker by 30-year-old Richard Ernest. But later that evening, when Ernest stopped at a rest area to get some sleep, Parsons stabbed him to death, stole his car, and ended up getting arrested later that same day. However, in court, Parsons claimed that he had to kill Ernest to fend off a homosexual advance. But the prosecution ended up providing witness testimony of Parsons' history of homosexual activity in jail. So in the end, Parsons was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Parsons requested 3 Burger King Whoppers, 2 orders of french fries, chocolate chip ice cream, a chocolate shake, and a pack of grape Hubba Bubba bubblegum. He also asked if he could share this meal with his brother and cousin, and this request was granted. In my opinion, this meal was pretty average, but being able to share your final moments with loved ones is invaluable, so I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're looking at the selection of Alton Coleman. In 1984, Coleman and his partner Deborah Brown went on a 3-month killing spree across the American Midwest. Over this period, the duo stole multiple cars, kidnapped numerous children, and claimed the lives of 8 total victims. But in the end, the duo was captured and they were both sentenced to death by lethal injection. However, Deborah Brown eventually had her sentence commuted to life imprisonment due to her extremely low IQ. So for Coleman's final meal, he requested a well-done filet mignon smothered with mushrooms, fried chicken breasts, onion rings, french fries, collard greens, broccoli with melted cheese, cornbread, biscuits and gravy, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, a salad with French dressing, and a cherry Coke. In my opinion, this spread was not only massive and diverse, but it also had the best cohesion out of all the meals I've tried thus far. So, I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're taking a look at the man who ordered one of the most expensive final meal requests in history, Robert Dale Conklin. On March 28, 1984, Conklin invited his lover, 28-year-old George Crooks, to his apartment. But shortly after he arrived, an altercation between the two broke out and Conklin stabbed him through the ear with a screwdriver, dismembered and disposed of his body, and blended up his internal organs in the garbage disposal. But in the end, Crooks' remains were still found and Conklin was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Conklin requested a bacon-wrapped filet mignon, garlic butter lemon shrimp, corn on the cob, a loaded baked potato, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, French bread with butter, goat cheese, cantaloupe, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and iced tea. In my opinion, this meal was stacked with delicious dishes, a ton of variety, and as much quantity as you could want. I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Russell Bucklew. On Valentine's Day of 1996, Bucklew's girlfriend Stephanie Ray broke up with him and they went their separate ways. But when Bucklew began to stalk their old trailer, he found that Ray was with the new man, Michael Sanders. So after threatening the pair multiple times, he eventually went on to break into their trailer dual-wielding pistols, gunned down Sanders, and fired a shot at one of his children, but missed. Also, Bucklew kidnapped Ray as he fled the scene. However, he was quickly tracked down and was captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Bucklew requested 2 chili cheese dogs, a bacon cheeseburger, a sausage and pepperoni pizza, a bucket of fried chicken, fried fish with tartar sauce, a pound of barbecue, a pint of ice cream, and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola. In my opinion, this meal had tons of variety, plenty of quantity, and was chocked full of comforting dishes. I'm placing this meal in S tier. Today, we're taking a look at a man with one of the largest final meal requests in history, Stephen Michael Woods. In 2001, Woods and a friend lured out a couple to an isolated road and proceeded to kill them both. However, during the trial, Woods' accomplice admitted to being the one who carried out both murders. He received a life sentence, but the Texas law of parties states that even if you aren't the one that commits the crime, you may still be found guilty if you're an involved conspirator. So when he pled innocent, Stephen Michael Woods was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Woods requested 2 pounds of bacon, 4 fried chicken breasts, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers with bacon and a side of fries, 12 garlic breadsticks with marinara sauce, 1 large 4-meat pizza, 2 sweet teas, root beers, Mountain Dews, and Pepsis, and 2 pints of ice cream. In my opinion, this meal was beyond dominant in every possible category of evaluation. I'm placing this meal in S tier.
Today, we're looking at the selection of Lawrence Russell Brewer. In 1998, Brewer and two friends kidnapped James Byrd Jr. and then proceeded to hook him up with logging chains and dragged his body from the back of their truck for 3 miles until his death. For these crimes, Brewer was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Brewer requested 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and onions, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, a bowl of fried okra with ketchup, a pound of barbecue meat with a half loaf of white bread, 3 fajitas served with all the fixings, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge, and 3 root beers. But when they brought him out the meal, Brewer said he wasn't hungry and declined it. And from that day forward, Texas discontinued final meal requests forever. In my opinion, this meal was a bit surprising. In contrast to every single other aspect of this dude's existence, this meal was excellent. So, I'm placing this meal in S tier.
Today, we're taking a look at the selection of Dennis Bagwell. On September 20th, 1995, Bagwell and his girlfriend drove to his mother's house and asked to borrow some money. However, to his curiosity, she only offered him $20. So he angrily went back to his car to tell his girlfriend what had happened and then stormed back into the house. Once inside, he proceeded to break his mother's neck and strangle her to death, shoot his half-sister in the head, crush the skull of her daughter, then strangled and violated his 14-year-old relative. And though he tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, he was ultimately captured and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Bagwell requested a steak, fried chicken, barbecue ribs, french fries and onion rings, a pound of bacon, a dozen scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, sliced tomatoes, salad, 2 hamburgers, peach cobbler, coffee, milk, and iced tea. In my opinion, this spread had a great variety of dishes and each one was incredibly comforting. I'm placing this meal in S tier.
Today, we are looking at the selection of Peter J. Miniel. On May 8th, 1986, Peter and his friends stopped by the apartment of 20-year-old Paul Minier, but upon their arrival, they decided they wanted to rob him. So when Paul was distracted, Peter beat him over the head with a beer mug and asked his friend to strike him with a nearby shock absorber. However, because Paul still remained conscious, Peter demanded his friend finish the job with a knife. But when he hesitated, Peter took it from his hand and proceeded to stab Paul 39 times himself. So, for this crime, Miniel was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For his final meal, Miniel requested 20 beef enchiladas, 20 beef tacos, 2 double cheeseburgers, a pizza with jalapenos, fried chicken, spaghetti with salt, half a chocolate cake, half a vanilla cake, 2 types of ice cream, a small fruit cake, and 2 each of orange juice, root beer, Pepsi, and Coca-Cola. In my opinion, not every part of the meal was my favorite, but the sheer diversity of solid options makes it tough to beat, so I'm placing this meal in S tier.
Today, we're finally taking a look at the selection of Josh Slavin. On August 31st, 2023, Slavin posted his first death row meal. However, unbeknownst to him, he'd go on to continue posting these for the next year and a half. But eventually, thanks to the support of his intelligent and kind and demure viewers, he decided to take the leap and quit his full-time corporate job. But unfortunately, due to the third law of influencer dynamics, as soon as he quit, he immediately dropped a course, pump and dumped a crypto project, and posted an apology video where he pretended to cry. In the end, Slavin was ultimately captured and sentenced to die by the Brazen Bull. For his final meal, Josh requested pizza, fruit, ramen, a flight of breads, assorted sauces and palate cleansers, various sausages and mustards, a gyro and fried plantains, these items, banana bread French toast, tres leches cake and mango sticky rice, cherry cobbler, and an assortment of beverages. In my opinion, this meal is the perfect symphony of flavors and textures and leaves absolutely nothing to be desired. I'm placing this meal in S tier. And from the bottom of my heart, you guys' support has changed my life, and for that, I will be eternally grateful. Thank you guys so much.